Marcus Chen was not a special man, and he knew this very well because his whole life had been ordinary in every possible way, and he had accepted this fact a long time ago, when he realized that some people are meant to change the world and others are meant to count numbers in small offices. He worked as an accountant in Cleveland, and his days were always the same, where he would wake up at 6 in the morning and drink his coffee black and drive his old Honda to work and sit in his small cubicle and look at spreadsheets until his eyes hurt, and then he would drive home and eat dinner alone and watch television and go to sleep, and the next day would be exactly the same. Marcus was 34 years old, and he had never been married, and he had never traveled outside of the United States, and he had never done anything that anyone would consider exciting or brave or interesting. And he was fine with this because excitement seemed exhausting, and he preferred the comfort of routine. On the night that everything changed, he was sleeping in his small apartment on the 3rd floor of a building that was old and ugly, and he was dreaming about nothing important, when a sound woke him up, and at first he thought it was thunder because the sound was so deep and loud that it shook the walls and made his windows rattle. He got out of bed and walked to his window, and what he saw made him think that he was still dreaming, because there was a ship in the sky, and it was not an airplane, and it was not a helicopter, and it was something that his brain could not understand at first. The ship was enormous, and it glowed with a blue light that was so bright that it turned the night into day, and Marcus stood there with his mouth open, and his heart beating so fast that he could hear it in his ears, and he watched as smaller ships came down from the big one and landed in the parking lot of his building. He should have run, but his legs would not move, and he should have called someone. But his phone was in the other room, and before he could do anything at all, his door exploded inward, and creatures walked into his apartment. And they were tall, and their skin was silver, and they had 4 arms each, and their eyes were completely black. One of them pointed at Marcus and said something in a language he did not understand. And then 2 others grabbed him by his arms and lifted him off the ground as if he weighed nothing at all. And Marcus tried to scream, but no sound came out of his mouth. They carried him out of his apartment and into the parking lot, where one of the smaller ships was waiting, and inside the ship there were more of the silver creatures, and they strapped him into a seat, and the ship rose into the air so fast that Marcus felt like his stomach had been left behind on the ground. He passed out from the fear and the pressure. And when he woke up, he was no longer on Earth, and he knew this because when he looked out of the window, he saw stars everywhere. And in the distance, there was a planet that was purple and green, and it was getting closer. The ship landed on this planet, and the silver creatures took Marcus out and walked him through streets made of crystal and past buildings that touched the clouds, and everywhere he looked there were more of these beings, and they all stopped to stare at him as if he was the strangest thing they had ever seen. Finally, they brought him to a building that was bigger than all the others, and inside this building there was a room that was so large that Marcus could not see the walls, and in the center of this room there was a throne, and on the throne sat a creature that was different from the others. This creature was female, and Marcus could tell this even though she was not human, because there was something graceful about the way she moved, and something beautiful about the way her silver skin seemed to glow from within. And she had 4 arms like the others, but her eyes were not black, and instead they were a deep purple color that reminded Marcus of the sunset. She stood up when she saw him, and she was tall, and probably 7 feet at least, and she looked at Marcus with an expression that he recognized immediately because it was the same expression he saw on people's faces when they received bad news. And older creatures stepped forward and spoke in English, and Marcus was so surprised to hear his own language that he almost fell over. The creature said that Marcus had been chosen, and that he had been chosen because of a treaty that was signed thousands of years ago between the Valorian Empire and the planet Earth. And this treaty stated that if ever the 2 species were in danger of war, then a marriage would unite them and prevent the destruction of both worlds. Marcus did not understand what this meant, and he said so. And the old creature explained that Earth had been visited by Valorians long ago, and the humans at that time had agreed to this treaty. And now the treaty had been activated because a war was coming, and the only way to stop it was for a human to marry into the Valorian royal family. The female on the throne was Empress Designate Sharath, as she was the heir to the entire Valorian Empire, and she was going to be Marcus's wife, whether he liked it or not. Marcus looked at Sharath, and Sharath looked at Marcus, and neither of them seemed happy about this situation, and Marcus could see that she was just as much a prisoner of this treaty as he was. He asked if he could go home, and the old creature said no. And he asked if he could call his family, and the old creature said there was no way to communicate with Earth from this distance. And he asked how long he had before the wedding, and the old creature said 3 days to prepare for a wedding to an alien princess on a planet he had never heard of in a galaxy he could not even name. And Marcus felt his legs go weak, and he sat down on the crystal floor and put his head in his hand. Sharath said something in her language, and her voice was cold and sharp, and even though Marcus did not understand the words, he understood the tone, and she was angry, and she was disgusted, and she was looking at him like he was an insect that had crawled into her throne room. The old creature translated and said that the Empress Designate wished for Marcus to be taken to his chambers, and that she would not see him again until the ceremony. And Marcus was lifted to his feet and taken away through crystal corridors to a room that was beautiful but felt like a prison. He sat on the bed that was too big and too soft, and he looked out the window at a sky that had 3 moons, and he thought about his small apartment in Cleveland and his boring job and his ordinary life, and he realized that he would give anything to have all of that back. But there was no going back, and Marcus Chun, the accountant from Cleveland, was going to marry an alien empress in 3 days, and there was nothing he could do about it. And for the first time in his life, he understood that the universe was much bigger and much stranger than he had ever imagined, and he was completely and utterly alone in it. Marcus did not sleep that first night, because every time he closed his eyes, he saw the silver faces of the Valorians, and he heard the cold voice of Sharath, and he felt the weight of what was happening pressing down on his chest like a stone. When the morning came, and the 3 suns of this strange planet rose into the sky and filled his room with golden light, he made a decision, and the decision was simple, and it was this: if he was going to be stuck here, then he was going to learn everything he could about this place and these people, because knowledge was the only weapon he had. He called for the servants, and they came, and they were surprised when he asked them questions about their culture and their history and their language, because they had expected him to cry or beg or try to escape. But instead he sat down with them and he listened. Servants were kind to him, even though they had been told not to like him, and they taught him the basics of the Valorian language, and they explained the customs and the traditions, and they told him about the Empress Designate, and who she really was. Sharath was not just angry about the marriage, and Marcus learned that she had been promised to someone else, and that someone was a powerful warlord named Commander Dravik, who controlled half of the Valorian military, and who had been courting Sharath for many years, and who believed that she belonged to him. The treaty with Earth had ruined everything for Dravik, and it had also ruined everything for Sharath, because she had not chosen Marcus, and she had not chosen Dravik either, but at least Dravik was Valorian, and at least Dravik was powerful, and at least Dravik was not a small, weak human who looked like a child compared to her people. Marcus understood her anger now, and he did not blame her for it, because she was just as trapped as he was, and her whole future had been decided by people who had died thousands of years ago, and she had no more choice in this than he died. In the second day, Marcus asked to see the palace library, and the servants were shocked, because no one had ever asked for such a thing, but they took him there. And the library was enormous, and it contained the knowledge of a civilization that was older than human history itself. Marcus spent hours reading about Valorian culture and he learned that they valued three things above all else: strength and honor and courage, and that these three things were more important than wealth or power, or even love, and that a Valorian who showed weakness was considered worthless. He also learned about Shirath herself, and he read about her accomplishments and her victories, and he discovered that she was not just a princess waiting for a crown, but a warrior who had led armies, and a scholar who had written books, and a leader who was loved by her people. And he learned about the Nethera flower, which was considered the most precious gift one could give to a Valorian because it only grew in a region called the Shadowlands, where the light of the three suns never reached, and where dangerous creatures lived, and where many Valorians had died trying to retrieve one. Nethera flower glowed with its own light, and it was said that giving one to someone was a declaration that you would face any danger for them and that your courage was without limit. And Marcus read this, and he thought about Shirath, and he made another decision on the night of the second day while everyone slept. Marcus left his chambers, and he found his way out of the palace, and he walked into the darkness beyond the city, and he headed toward the Shadowlands because he had memorized the maps in the library, and he knew exactly where to go. The journey was long and difficult, and Marcus was not a strong man, and he was not a fast man, and he had never done anything brave in his entire life, but he kept walking because he understood something important, and what he understood was this: Shirath would never respect him if he did not earn that respect, and respect could not be given, and it could only be earned through action. The Shadowlands were terrifying, and Marcus could hear creatures moving in the darkness all around him, and he could feel eyes watching him from places he could not see, and several times he almost turned back. But he did not turn back because he had come too far, and because he refused to be the weak human that everyone expected him to be. He searched for hours, and his feet were bleeding, and his body was exhausted, and he was so afraid that his hands would not stop shaking. But finally he found what he was looking for, and there, in a clearing surrounded by darkness, was a single Nethera flower glowing with a soft blue light. Marcus reached for it, and that was when the creature attacked, and it came from the shadows so fast that he barely saw it, and it knocked him to the ground, and its claws cut into his arm, and he screamed in pain and fear. But something happened in that moment, and Marcus did not know where it came from, but his strength rose up inside him, and he grabbed a rock from the ground, and he hit the creature with all his might, and he hit it again and again until it stopped moving, and then he grabbed the flower, and he ran through the darkness, and he ran past the creatures that watched him from the shadows, and he ran until he reached the edge of the city, and then he collapsed on the crystal streets, and the guards found him, and they carried him back to the palace. When he woke up, it was the morning of the third day, and the day of the wedding, and his arm was bandaged, and his body hurt everywhere, but he still had the flower, and he held it tight in his hand as the servants came to prepare him for the ceremony. They brought him to the throne room, and Shirath was there waiting, and she was wearing a gown that was made of light itself, and she was beautiful in a way that Marcus had never seen anyone be beautiful before, and she looked at him with the same cold expression she had worn when they first met. But Marcus walked up to her, and he held out the Nethera flower, and the entire room went silent because everyone knew what this meant, and everyone knew where the flower came from, and everyone understood that this small, weak human had done something that many Valorians were too afraid to. Doxoreth took the flower, and she looked at it, and then she looked at Marcus, and for the first time her expression changed, and the coldness left her eyes, and what replaced it was something that Marcus could not name, but it was not hatred, and it was not disgust. She asked him why he had done this, and Marcus said that he knew she did not choose him, and that he knew she did not want this, but that if they were going to be married, then he wanted her to know that he was not going to be a burden to her, and that he would do whatever it took to be worthy of standing beside her. Xyrith was quiet for a long time, and then she did something that shocked everyone in the room, and she smiled, and it was a small smile, and it was brief, but it was real, and Marcus knew in that moment that something had changed between them. the servants came to finish preparing them for the wedding, and as they led Marcus away, Sharath called out to him, and she said one word in English, and the word was, "Thank you." And Marcus carried that word with him like a treasure, because he understood that from the Empress Designate of the Valorian Empire, those two words meant more than any speech could have meant. He had not won her heart, and he had not changed her mind about the marriage, but he had done something that no one had expected, and he had earned her curiosity and her respect. And for a man who had been nothing but ordinary his entire life, that felt like the greatest victory he had ever achieved. The wedding ceremony was like nothing Marcus had ever imagined, and he stood in the great hall of the palace surrounded by thousands of Valorians who had come from every corner of the empire to witness this historic moment, and above them, enormous screens showed the ceremony to billions more who watched from their homes on distant planets. Marcus wore robes that were made of a fabric he could not name, and the fabric changed color as he moved and shifted from blue to silver to gold, and the Valorian tailors had worked through the night to make clothes that would fit his small human body. Dixareth stood across from him at the altar, and she was dressed in white light that seemed to flow around her like water, and her forearms were decorated with golden bands, and her purple eyes looked at Marcus with an expression that was no longer cold, but was still guarded and careful. The priest was ancient, and his silver skin had faded to almost gray, and he spoke in a voice that echoed through the hall, and he recited words that had been spoken at Valorian weddings for 10,000 years. Marcus had memorized his part of the ceremony, and when his turn came to speak the vows, he spoke them in High Valorian, and his pronunciation was not perfect, but it was good enough, and the crowd murmured in surprise, because they had not expected a human to learn their sacred language in just 3 days. He promised to stand with Sharath in times of peace and in times of war, and he promised to honor her and her people, and he promised to give his life if necessary to protect the bond between their worlds. And as he spoke these words, he realized that he meant them, and that somewhere in the past 3 days this had stopped being just a forced arrangement and had become something real. Dixareth spoke her vows in return, and her voice was strong and clear, and she looked directly at Marcus as she spoke, and he saw something in her eyes that had not been there before, and it was not love, because love takes time to grow, but it was the beginning of something that could become love if given the chance. The priest raised his hands and declared them bonded for life, and the crowd cheered, and the sound was so loud that Marcus felt it in his bones, and confetti made of light fell from the ceiling, and music played from somewhere, and for one perfect moment everything was beautiful and right. And then the doors of the great hall exploded inward, and everything changed. Soldiers poured into the room, and they were not wearing the colors of the palace guard, and they were armed with weapons that glowed with deadly energy, and behind them came a figure that Marcus recognized from the pictures he had seen in the library. Commander Dravik was even more terrifying in person than he had been in the images, and he was 8 feet tall, and his body was covered in scars from countless battles, and his forearms each held a different weapon, and his black eyes burned with a fury that made Marcus want to run. And Hidedravik walked through the crowd, and the people parted before him like water, and he stopped in front of the altar, and he looked at Sharath with an expression that was equal parts love and rage, and he said that this marriage was a fraud and an insult, and that he would not allow it to stand. The palace guards tried to stop him, but Dravik's soldiers were too many and too well armed, and within moments the guards were defeated, and Dravik's forces controlled the entire hall. The old priest stepped forward and reminded Dravik that the marriage had been completed according to the ancient laws, and that nothing could undo what had been done. But Dravik laughed and said that there was one thing that could undo. Eyes pointed at Marcus and declared a challenge of ritual combat, and Marcus felt his blood turn to ice because he knew what this meant, and he had read about it in the library. Ritual combat was an ancient Valorian tradition, and it allowed any warrior to challenge another for anything they possessed, and the challenge could not be refused without bringing shame upon your entire bloodline, and the combat was always to the death. Xeros stepped forward and said that Marcus was a human, and that he did not know their ways, and that the challenge was unfair. But Dravik said that the moment Marcus spoke the Valorian vows, he accepted all Valorian laws and traditions, and that the challenge was valid. The old priest confirmed that Dravik was correct, and that Marcus had no choice but to accept the challenge or forever be known as a coward and bring shame upon Earth and upon his new wife. Marcus looked at Sharath, and she looked back at him, and he could see fear in her eyes, but not fear for herself, because she was too proud for that, but fear for him, because she knew that he could not win, and that he was going to Dravik. Smiled, and it was a cruel smile, and he said that the combat would take place in 1 hour in the arena of champions, and that all the people of the Empire would watch as he killed the human and took what was rightfully his. The soldiers took Marcus away, and they brought him to a room beneath the arena where he would prepare for his death, and they gave him armor that was too big and weapons that were too heavy, and they looked at him with pity, because they knew that he had no chance. Marcus sat alone in that room, and he thought about his life and all the ordinary days he had lived, and he thought about Cleveland and his apartment and his job, and he thought about how far away all of that seemed now. He also thought about Sharath and the smile she had given him that morning, and the way she had said thank you, and he realized that he did not want to die, but more than that, he did not want to fail her, because she had finally started to see him as something more than a weak human, and he could not bear to prove her wrong. So he did what he had always done when faced with a problem that seemed impossible, and he thought, and he analyzed, and he remembered everything he had learned about Dravik in the library. He remembered that Dravik had never lost a fight in 200 years, and he remembered the videos he had watched of Dravik's battles, and he remembered every move that Dravik had made in those fights, and slowly a pattern began to form in his mind. Marcus was not strong, and he was not fast, and he could not win a fight against Dravik through combat, but he was an accountant, and accountants were trained to find patterns in chaos and to see what others could not see, and Marcus had found something in every single fight. Dravik shifted his weight to the left before he delivered a killing blow, and it was a small movement, and it was almost invisible, but it was there, and it was consistent, and Marcus had noticed it when no one else had. He did not know if this would be enough to save him, but it was all he had, and when the guards came to take him to the arena, he walked with his head held high, because he was not going to die like a coward, and he was not going to bring shame upon Sharath or upon his planet. The arena was filled with 100,000 Valorians, and billions more watched from across the galaxy, and Marcus stepped onto the sand and looked across at Dravik, who was smiling because he thought this was going to be. Ezixareth sat in the row box, and her face was pale, and her hands were gripping the arms of her chair, and Marcus looked at her, and he nodded once as if to say that everything was going to be all right, even though he was not sure that it would be. Horns sounded and the fight began, and Marcus knew that the next few minutes would determine everything, and that his entire ordinary life had been leading to this moment. Dravik charged at Marcus the moment the horn sounded, and he moved so fast that Marcus barely saw him coming, and the crowd roared because they knew this fight would be over in seconds, and they were right, but not in the way they expected. Marcus did not try to fight back because he knew that would be suicide, and instead he did the only thing he could do, and he moved not toward Dravik, but away from him and to the right, because he remembered the pattern, and he knew that Dravik favored his left side. The blade passed so close to Marcus that he felt the wind of it on his face, and the crowd gasped because no one had ever dodged Dravik's first strike, and Dravik himself looked surprised for just a moment before he attacked. Again Marcus kept moving, and he did not stop moving, because the moment he stopped moving, he would die, and he watched Dravik's body with the same focus he had once used to examine spreadsheets, and he saw every shift of weight and every twitch of muscle, and he predicted where the attacks would come before they arrived. Dravik grew frustrated, because this was not how fights were supposed to go, and his opponent was supposed to stand and fight like a warrior and not dance around like a frightened animal, and he began to attack faster and harder and more recklessly. The crowd did not know what to think because they had never seen anything like this, and some of them began to laugh because they thought Marcus was a coward who was just delaying his death, but others began to watch more closely because they noticed that Marcus was not running randomly and that there was a purpose to his movements. Minutes passed and Dravik was breathing hard now because he had been attacking non-stop, and Marcus was still alive, and this had never happened before in all of Dravik's 200 years of combat. Marcus was tired too, and his legs burned and his lungs ached, and the armor was heavy, and the heat of the arena was unbearable, but he kept moving because stopping meant dying, and he was not ready to die. Dravik screamed in rage and launched his most powerful attack yet, and all four of his arms moved at once, and his weapons sliced through the air in patterns that seemed impossible to avoid, and Marcus felt one blade cut across his chest and another graze his leg, and he stumbled. The crowd cheered because they thought this was the end, and Dravik raised his weapons for the killing blow, and Marcus saw it, and he saw the shift in Dravik's weight, and he saw that it was to the left, just like always. And in that moment, Marcus threw himself to the right. Dravik's weapons hit nothing but sand, and his momentum carried him forward, and he stumbled, and for just 1 second he was off balance, and Marcus saw his chance. But Marcus did not attack because he was not a killer, and he had never hurt anyone in his life, and even now, facing the man who wanted to murder him, he could not bring himself to take a life. Instead, he did something that no one expected, and he stepped back and he dropped his weapons and he extended his hand toward Dravik. The arena went completely silent because no one understood what was happening, and Dravik himself froze with his weapons raised because this was not how combat worked, and there was no move in all of Valorian fighting that looked like this. Marcus spoke, and his voice was loud enough for everyone to hear, and he said that he did not want to kill Dravik, and that he did not want anyone to die today, and that if Dravik yielded, then this could end without more blood. Dravik stared at Marcus as if he was looking at a creature from another world, which in a way he was, and for a long moment no one moved and no one spoke, and the entire galaxy held its breath. Then Dravik laughed, and it was not a cruel laugh but a laugh of disbelief, and he said that Marcus was either the bravest being he had ever met or the stupidest, and he could not decide which. He attacked again, but this time there was something different about his movements, and Marcus could see that the rage was gone, and in its place was something else, and it was exhaustion and confusion, and maybe even a little bit of respect. Marcus dodged again and again, and Dravik kept attacking, but his heart was no longer in it. And finally, after what felt like hours, Dravik stopped, and he stood in the center of the arena, breathing hard and looking at Marcus with an expression that no one had ever seen on his face before. He said that in 200 years no opponent had ever offered him mercy, and that in 200 years no opponent had ever survived long enough to make such an offer, and that he did not know what to do with this. Marcus said that Dravik could yield, and that there was no shame in yielding to an opponent who had earned his respect, and that strength was not just about fighting but also about knowing when to stop fighting. The crowd murmured because this was against everything they believed, and in Valorian culture you fought until you won or until you died, and there was no middle ground. But Dravik looked at Marcus, and he saw something that he had never seen in an opponent before. And it was not weakness, and it was not fear, and it was something that he could not name, but that made him feel small in a way that no defeat had ever made him feel. He dropped his weapons, and they hit the sand with a sound that echoed through the silent arena, and he lowered his head, and he said one word, and the word was yield. The crowd exploded with noise, and half of them were cheering, and half of them were shouting in disbelief, and Marcus stood there in the center of it all, and he did not feel like a victor because he knew that Dravik had not lost his strength or skill, but to something else. And Tyrelixoreth ran down from the row box, and she crossed the arena floor, and she stood in front of Marcus, and her eyes were filled with tears, and she asked him why he had not killed Dravik. When he had the chance, Marcus said that killing was easy, and that mercy was hard, and that he wanted to show the Valorian people that there was another way to be. Strong Sareth looked at him for a long time, and then she did something that she had never done before, and she put her 4 arms around him, and she held him close, and the crowd went wild because the Empress Designate was embracing the human who had just done the impossible. Dravik walked toward them, and the guards moved to stop him, but Sharath raised her hand, and they stepped back, and Dravik stood before Marcus, and he did something that shocked everyone even more than the yield had shocked them. He knelt, and he bowed his head, and he said that he had been wrong about humans, and that he had been wrong about Marcus, and that from this day forward he would serve the bond between Earth and Valoria, because anyone who could show mercy to an enemy was worthy of respect. Marcus helped Dravik to his feet, and the two of them stood side by side, and the crowd cheered again because they were witnessing history, and they knew that nothing would ever be the same. The old priest walked onto the arena floor, and he raised his hands, and he declared that the challenge was complete, and that the marriage between Marcus and Sharath was valid and unbreakable, and that the bond between Earth and Valoria was sealed forever. Marcus looked at Sharath, and she looked at him, and for the first time since he had been taken from his apartment in Cleveland, he felt like maybe everything was going to be all right. He had come to this planet as a prisoner, and he had been forced into a marriage he did not want, but somehow through courage and kindness and a little bit of luck he had become something more. He had become a symbol of hope for 2 worlds, and he had proven that strength did not always come from muscles and weapons, but sometimes came from the heart. And as he walked out of the arena with Sharath by his side and Dravik following behind them, he knew that his ordinary life was over, and that something extraordinary had just begun. 5 years had passed since the day Marcus Chun had stood in that arena and offered his hand to Commander Dravik, and in those 5 years, everything had changed, and Marcus had changed most of all. He was no longer the frightened accountant who had been dragged from his apartment in Cleveland and forced to marry an alien princess, and now he was Emperor Marcus I, and he sat beside Sharath on the throne of the Valorian Empire, and together they ruled over 100 billion souls. The journey from that day in the arena to this moment on the throne had not been easy, and there had been many who did not accept a human as their ruler, and there had been plots against his life and rebellions in the outer territories, and moments when Marcus had wondered if he had made a terrible mistake, but Sharath had stood beside him through all of it, and their partnership had grown into something deeper, and what had started as a forced marriage had become a true bond built on respect and trust. And eventually on love. Dravik had kept his word, and he had become Marcus's most loyal protector and advisor, and the warrior who had once tried to kill him was now the one who would die to defend him, and this transformation had inspired others. Throughout the Empire, the people of Valoria had learned that humans were not weak, and that strength came in many forms, and that courage did not always mean fighting, but sometimes meant standing firm in your beliefs, even when everyone else told you that you were wrong. Marcus had used his position to change things, not just for Valoria, but for Earth as well, and the first thing he had done was to send ambassadors to his home planet and to invite humans to join the galactic community, not as subjects, but as equals. The leaders of Earth had been shocked to learn that one of their own had become an emperor in a civilization they did not even know existed, and there had been fear at first, because humans were not ready for the knowledge that they were not alone in the universe. But Marcus had handled the introduction carefully, and he had brought scientists and artists and teachers from both worlds together, and he had shown them that despite the differences between their species, they shared the same hopes and dreams, and fears exchange programs were established, and young Valorians traveled to Earth to learn about human culture, and young humans traveled to Valoria to study technology and science that was thousands of years more advanced than anything on their home world. Marcus had made sure that the technology was shared freely and not used as a weapon of control, and within just a few years, Earth had begun to transform, and diseases that had killed millions were cured, and energy problems that had threatened the planet were solved, and humanity took its first steps toward the stars. Not everyone on Earth was happy with these changes, and there were those who feared the aliens and those who resented being told that they were not the center of the universe, and there were protests and riots and even attempts to break off contact with Valoria. But Marcus addressed these concerns with patience and understanding, and he remembered what it was like to be ordinary and afraid, and he never forgot that he had once been just like them. He established the Council of Two Worlds, which brought together leaders from both Earth and Valoria to make decisions that affected both species, and he gave up some of his own power to make sure that no one person or one world could dominate the Earth. Had worried that this would make them look weak, but Marcus explained that true leadership was not about holding power but about sharing it, and that a ruler who was loved would always be stronger than a ruler who was feared. The years passed, and Marcus and Shirath had children, and their children were the first hybrids ever born between humans and Valorians, and they were beautiful and strange, and they represented the hope of a future where the two species would become one. Marcus watched his children grow, and he taught them the lessons he had learned, and he told them stories about Cleveland and about his small apartment and about the ordinary life he had lived before the night the ships came. He wanted them to know that greatness was not something you were born with, but something you chose, and that anyone could change the world if they were brave enough to try. On the 10th anniversary of his marriage to Shirath, there was a ceremony in the capital city, and millions of Valorians and thousands of humans gathered to celebrate, and Marcus stood on a balcony overlooking the crowd, and he remembered the scared man he had been when he first stood in this city. A journalist from Earth asked him how he had done it, and how a simple accountant had become the most influential human in the galaxy. And Marcus smiled because he had been asked this question many times, and he always gave the same answer. He said that he had just paid attention, and that he had never stopped believing that kindness was stronger than cruelty, and that these two simple things had carried him through every challenge he had faced. The journalist asked if he had any regrets, and Marcus thought about this for a long time before answering, and he said that he missed Cleveland sometimes, and that he missed the simplicity of his old life, and that there were days when he wished he could go back to being nobody. But then he looked at Shirath, who was standing beside him with their children, and he looked at the crowd below filled with humans and Valorians standing together in peace, and he said that no, he did not regret anything because this was exactly where he was supposed to be. Valorians built a statue of Marcus in the center of the capital, and it was made of the same crystal that the city was built from, and it glowed with an inner light, just like the Nethera flower he had picked all those years ago. The statue did not show Marcus holding a weapon or standing in a pose of power, and instead it showed him with his hand extended just as he had extended it to Dravik in the arena, and at the base of the statue were carved the words that had become his legacy. The words said that mercy is the highest form of strength, and that anyone who reads these words should remember that the universe is changed not by those who fight the hardest, but by those who love the deepest. Marcus Chun lived for many more years, and he saw his children grow and have children of their own, and he saw Earth become a full member of the galactic community, and he saw wars end and alliances form and a future take shape that was brighter than anything he could have imagined when he was just an accountant in Cleveland. When he finally died at the age of 112, he was surrounded by his family and by Dravik, who had never left his side, and by Sharath, who held his hand as he took his last breath. The funeral was attended by beings from 1,000 different worlds, and for one day, the entire galaxy paused to honor the human who had shown them a different way to be strong. And somewhere on Earth, in a small city called Cleveland, there was a museum dedicated to his memory, and in that museum was a replica of his old apartment, just as it had been on the night. The ships came, and people would visit from all over the world to see where it all began. They would stand in that small, ordinary space, and they would look at the window where Marcus had first seen the lights in the sky, and they would remember that greatness can come from anywhere, and that the most ordinary person can change the universe if they are brave enough to extend their hand. This was the legacy of Marcus Chen, the accountant who became an emperor, and his story would be told for generations to come as a reminder that kindness is never weakness, and that mercy is never defeat, and that the true measure of a person is not what they take from the world, but what they give to it.